What you are about to hear is documented in official records of one of the largest airlines in the United States. Signed by trained professionals, filed through official channels. Confirmed in writing by a vice president of the airline itself. This is a true story. December 29th, 1972, John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York City. Eastern Airlines Flight 401, scheduled departure, 9:20 p.m., destination Miami, Florida. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, at the time, one of the most advanced passenger jets in the world. 163 passengers boarded that night, a cross-section of ordinary American life, families heading home for the holidays, business travelers closing out the year, a couple on their way to a Miami vacation. Nobody on that plane had any reason to believe this flight would be anything other than routine. The cockpit door closed at 9:15 p.m. And at 9:20 p.m., Flight 401 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. For the first 2 hours and 12 minutes. In the cockpit that night were three of Eastern Airlines' most experienced crew members. Captain Bob Loft, 55 years old, 32 years of flying experience, not one serious incident in 32 years. His colleagues remembered him as the calmest person in any cockpit he had ever entered. First Officer Bert Stockstill, 39 years old, known among crews for his obsessive attention to procedure, the kind of pilot who checks his checklist twice before he's satisfied. And Flight Engineer Don Repo, 51 years old, 20 years with Eastern Airlines, the man who knew every mechanical system on the L-1011 better than almost anyone alive. Three professionals at the top of their field, three men with families at home, three men who expected to be back in New York by morning. At 11:32 p.m., the crew of Flight 401 began their descent into Miami. Standard procedure. The landing gear was lowered. 3 green lights should illuminate to confirm the landing gear is down and locked. 2 lights came on, 1 did not. Captain Loft contacted Miami Approach Control and requested permission to circle while the crew investigated. The request was approved. Flight 401 entered a holding pattern over the Everglades. The autopilot was engaged to hold altitude at 2,000 feet. Don Repo opened a floor hatch in the cockpit and climbed down into the avionics bay below to visually confirm the landing gear position. Loft and Stockstill remained focused on the panel, troubleshooting the indicator. And nobody noticed that sometime during this process, the autopilot had been accidentally disengaged. The plane was descending, slowly, silently, without a single crew member looking at the altimeter. Below the aircraft, the Florida Everglades stretched in every direction. No lights, no roads, no landmarks, just flat black swampland and open water. 1,400 feet, 1,200 feet. The crew still focused on a single indicator light. In the cabin behind the cockpit, 163 people had no idea. A child was asleep against the window. A man was finishing the last pages of his novel. A woman was watching the darkness outside her window, thinking about the warm Miami morning waiting for her. 1,000 feet, 800 feet, 600 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. At 11:42 p.m., the altitude warning alert activated. First Officer Stockstill looked at the altimeter. 100 feet. One word left his mouth. At 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 struck the Florida Everglades at 227 miles per hour. 101 people died. 75 survived. Captain Loft died at the scene. Don Repo died in hospital the following morning. Bert Stockstill died on impact. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a full investigation. Their conclusion: crew distraction. The flight crew became so focused on troubleshooting the indicator light that they failed to monitor the aircraft's altitude. And here's where the investigation revealed something that is still difficult to accept. The landing gear had been down and locked the entire time. The indicator light bulb had simply come loose in its socket. It was never broken. A 75-cent bulb, slightly loose in its socket. 101 people, 3 of the best in the business, distracted by a loose light bulb, while the ground came up beneath them. In the weeks after the crash, Eastern Airlines began salvaging usable parts from the wreckage of Flight 401. Standard industry practice. Galley equipment, instruments, interior components. All of these parts were logged and installed in other L-1011 aircraft across the Eastern Airlines fleet. Nobody thought anything of it. This happened after every major crash. The parts were functional, the planes were airworthy. And for a few months, nothing unusual happened. Then, the reports began. The first formal report was filed in early 1973. A flight attendant on an Atlanta to Miami service, name withheld at her request. She was working alone in the aircraft galley during a late-night flight when she looked up and found a man standing in the galley doorway. Eastern Airlines uniform, flight engineer rank insignia, looking directly at her, not speaking, not moving. She described his expression as not quite blank, but not quite present either, like someone looking through her rather than at her. She stepped toward him. He was gone. The following day, she was shown photographs of Eastern Airlines crew members. She stopped at one photograph without hesitation. Don Repo, dead for 3 months, standing in the galley of an aircraft that contained parts salvaged from his crash. A second report followed. Different flight, different route, different crew member. The descriptions were nearly identical. The uniform, the rank, the stillness, the way he looked at them, the way he disappeared. Then came the account that changed everything. A senior flight attendant, 20 years of experience. On a flight from New York to Miami, she noticed a man in a captain's uniform sitting alone in first class, seat 1A. She approached to ask if he needed anything. He turned and looked directly at her. She recognized him immediately. Captain Bob Loft. She turned to get a colleague. When she returned 30 seconds later, the seat was empty. A safety belt was still buckled. What nobody knew at the time was that the vice president of Eastern Airlines was traveling on that flight. He filed a formal written statement. In it, he stated that he too had seen the same man in the same seat. A vice president of a major American airline, confirming a ghost sighting in a signed document. But the most significant account of all came in late 1973. A flight attendant and a flight engineer were working together in the aircraft galley late at night. Don Repo's face appeared in the oven door, visible in the reflective steel, to both of them. Both crew members froze. Unlike the other sightings, his expression was not blank. It was urgent. The flight engineer leaned toward the oven door. Don Repo appeared to be speaking. There will be a fire on this aircraft. Watch out for this plane. Then he was gone. The crew reported it to the captain immediately. The captain diverted the aircraft to the nearest airport. A full mechanical inspection was carried out. Engineers found a significant fault in one of the engines. Their assessment: if the fault had gone undetected, the aircraft would likely have suffered a catastrophic engine fire over open ocean. The passengers were never told. They deplaned normally. They went home safely. Don Repo had been dead for nearly a year. By 1974, Eastern Airlines management had received enough formal reports to act. A confidential internal memo was drafted and signed. The order: remove all salvaged components from Eastern Airlines Flight 401 from every aircraft in the fleet, immediately. No public statement was made. No explanation was offered. The parts were simply removed. And after the parts were removed, the sighting stopped. Completely. Immediately. Not one further sighting of Don Repo or Bob Loft was ever reported by any crew member on any flight ever again. Officially, Eastern Airlines denied all knowledge of any sightings. The internal documents tell a different story. In 1976, aerospace researcher John Fuller published a full account of the sightings after years of investigation. He interviewed dozens of Eastern Airlines employees. All of them consistent, all of them describing the same two men, all of them from people with no reason to lie and every professional reason to stay silent. Today, the crash site in the Everglades has been completely reclaimed by the swamp. No trace remains of Flight 401 or the 101 people who died there. A small memorial stands near the edge of the Everglades, left by families who still remember. Eastern Airlines itself no longer exists. The company declared bankruptcy in 1991. The gates are silent. The planes have been repainted in other liveries or scrapped entirely. But the incident reports still exist. The internal memos still exist. The vice president's signed written statement still exists. And 3 men who flew their last flight on December 29, 1972, are remembered not only for how they died, but for what multiple trained aviation professionals swear they witnessed afterward. We are left with an unanswered question. Dozens of trained professionals filed formal reports. A senior airline executive signed his name to a document confirming he saw a dead man sitting in first class. The sightings stopped the moment the parts were removed. Not gradually, not over time, immediately. So we ask, was something in those parts? Or was something following those parts? Don Repo spent 20 years making sure aircraft were safe to fly. According to the people who saw him after his death, he was still doing exactly that. This was Voces del Abismo. Subscribe, because the dead do not always stay quiet.